We invest a great deal of time understanding how different groups perceive us. How do they perceive our neutrality? You know, you can speak at length about neutrality. In fact, very often one can bore audiences about referring to it too much. But the interest in neutrality is only if you can prove that it actually helps you reach more people than if you didn't have that neutrality. And that's what the ICRC believes in. We believe that by not taking part in the political controversy that is underlying the dynamics in the conflict, we gain trust and therefore access. That's a fundamental aspect of our work. And in that context, there is an element that I'd like to turn to now, which is the it's a feature that has gained a lot of attention and attracted and generated a lot of debate over recent years, which is the issue of the militarization of aid or the greater involvement by armed forces in assistance responses. We've seen that in recent years there has been an increase of attacks against humanitarian agencies. And we have had to ask ourselves, you know, what were some of the reasons for that? Well, first of all, I think the first reason is that there are regrettably groups that are prepared to deliberately attack humanitarian agencies in a variety of environments, which are, of course, attacks that are unacceptable and that have to be condemned in the clearest terms. At the same time, there has been a debate around that is known in the humanitarian community as the blurring of lines debate, whereby the increased, this is the line of argumentation goes along the following sets of comments, that you have an increased involvement by armed forces in humanitarian responses. And I think it's important to have, from an ICRC perspective, the following in mind. The first thing is that there are very different situations. When armed forces are called upon to provide assistance in natural disasters, where the use of military assets can be really key in projecting a rapid response and to reaching the populations affected in the least amount of time, we think that it is perfectly understandable that military assets are used in such situations. We do think it is a very different issue when armed forces deploy in conflict environments. And I think we have to have an open discussion about that. The ICRC is not part of the humanitarian organizations that believes that the military should never respond to needs in humanitarian terms. It is in fact expected of armed forces under the Geneva Conventions that they provide humanitarian response when they see needs, such as wounded people at the end of a battle, or when civilians are displaced, and if no other organization is there, it is perfectly understandable for armed forces to provide first aid and the first response. But where we see a clear red line as far as the ICRC is concerned is when humanitarian action is integrated explicitly into counterinsurgency strategies. And what I mean by that is when armed forces deploy in a country, and this has taken place in the Afghan context, and then use the humanitarian response as part of an intelligence gathering operation. This I recall very clearly situations and statements by the ISAF. These are public statements. I can easily refer to those. They said that, and this is a quote, humanitarian assistance is helping the Afghan forces and international forces fight the war against terrorism. That was the quote at the time. Now, those are not statements that generate great enthusiasm at the level of the ICRC, because they create real problems of perception for what humanitarian action is about. We need to be understood as being separate from political and military logics. Otherwise, our own operations are at risk. I can refer to a recent visit that I carried out in Iraq, where whilst most people have a perception that Iraq has moved along very significantly, the numbers of casualties in Iraq, civilians killed in suicide attacks or other deliberate attacks against civilians, still surpass the number of civilians killed in Afghanistan last year. So just as an indication of where Iraq has improved on a number of fronts, but certainly civilians continue to be affected to very dramatic attacks there. The ICRC works in Iraq without armed escorts. It is therefore crucial that we are understood as being separate from political and military dynamics. But I think it is also only fair to say that the humanitarian organizations need to be more self-critical themselves of how they operate. What I mean by that, I think it is not credible when a humanitarian agency criticizes the military for blurring the lines and on a Monday, and on a Friday requests the same armed forces for armed escorts in order to have access to populations in need. One can't have it both ways, in our view. So that is also something to think of in overall terms for humanitarian agencies. Now, I conclude with just noting that these points are very important because they are related to security and access, because it's important for the ICRC to be and remain predictable to all parties. People need to understand how we work. In every armed conflict, we are under observation daily, and it takes you sometimes many months, and at times even many years, to build trust with a local actor, with a local armed group. And what I mean by trust is the space to work, the space to be able to move around, and you can lose that trust in an afternoon by an inappropriate statement, by a poorly implemented program. And so it really takes a great deal of attention. And when we think about our interaction with armed forces, we think that there is an interaction that is strengthened by a recognition of the respective roles and different mandates. That is for us crucial if we are to continue over the coming years to implement useful and meaningful responses for populations at risk. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be very pleased to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Pierre. That was incredibly rich and interesting, and you really raised a lot of issues, and I'm sure that there are a lot of questions from the audience. We have about 20 minutes. May I perhaps kick off the discussion? You talked about the ICRC sometimes boring audiences with the insistence on neutrality. I recall that Bernard Kouchner wasn't bored by neutrality, it made him very angry, and it's because he got angry with neutrality that he formed the Médecins Sans Frontières. But it does lead me to ask you again, in this increasingly complex environment in which you're operating, would you still say that neutrality is the greatest asset that the ICRC has to effectively perform its duties and to have relationships and to contact this increasingly diverse audience that you need to deal with in order to get your work done?
Well, thank you. I think that the first thing to say about neutrality is that, and the reason why I was saying that the ICRC can bore audiences with it is also that I think very often the ICRC has described neutrality primarily for what it is not. You have these kind of senses. We are neutral, therefore we can't tell you, or we're neutral, therefore we can't do this. And I always thought that why should anybody be interested in a principle that doesn't allow you to do something? I mean, it's only interesting if we turn it the other way around and actually insist on what it allows us to do. And that is in the case of Afghanistan or Iraq, is really literally to create the sense that we are not part of the conflict, we're not part of the controversy. And in fact, the strange thing that I always thought about neutrality is that you can very easily, when you speak about neutrality, give the impression that neutrality amounts to indifference. You know, physically, it's almost as if neutral means you take a step away from the arena. You go up into, you know, sort of the upper seats, you sit down and take a comfortable step back from what is happening. Well, in the ICRC's case, it's the exact opposite. Our staff are not at all characterized by going into comfortable environments. They work today in Baghdad. We have many staff members, and we also have colleagues that have lost their lives in those environments. We work in many of the most difficult zones around the world. And what we need is to create the space. And the reason what I mean by creating the space brings me to another notion. You know, there's a debate in the humanitarian community around the so-called shrinking humanitarian space. And this is, by the way, a notion that our colleagues in MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières at the time, introduced, the notion of the humanitarian space. Now, I just want to tell you, I don't think there is anything such as a pure protected humanitarian space. I'm going to push it now a bit, and you'll forgive me for that. Sometimes it sounds as if you're driving through a conflict zone and you have a sign suddenly tells you you're now entering the humanitarian space, and that there the humanitarian agencies can feel protected and at ease and respected. That does not exist. I mean, if one thinks that in the majority of places where we work, people consider humanitarian gesture to be noble by definition, we need to think again. It's hard work to convince people that it is justified for an external actor to be present in most of the conflict zones of today. It's hard work to create the confidence. I remember very well an armed group telling us it took us, they said, it was a group in the Middle East, a radical group in the Middle East said to us, it took us 4 years to get used to you, because every time you spoke of your neutrality, we thought that doesn't exist in a conflict zone. And every time you spoke about your independence, we looked at your list of largest donors and said, how does that work? And in fact, the reality is, it took them 4 years to observe whether what we were saying about ourselves was also what they were observing and how we were doing. And many people say to us today that they read what we write on our website and compare it to what they see in practice. And they say where there is a gap, we have a problem. If it's closely aligned, in other words, if you, so to speak, walk the talk, things are okay. So it's around that, and I think neutrality is a key element, but I would only emphasize it as as it were, an instrument for access. That's what it should be.
Okay. My name's Kate. It's just following on from the last answer to the introducer's question. You mentioned that there is almost a vacuum, that there is nobody negotiating peace. And I just wondered if the ICRC is flagging that as a potential future application of what it does already.
Yeah, and I think this is the difficult part, and sometimes, well, first of all, I think we have to recognize that I was referring, for instance, to the UN's role. And if one is very honest, I think the UN's mandate is a far more complicated mandate than the ICRC's, in a sense. Not that I think we're working in easy environments, but I think the diverse dimensions of the UN mandate, peace and security on the one hand, development, the whole humanitarian dimension, all these, to keep these all under one flag is a big challenge. And I think simply today, my sense is that the international community, as it were, has not yet resolved the issue of how to move from the Cold War framework in terms of negotiating settlements to today's environments. But this is clearly beyond what the ICRC can influence or play a role in. And even if we were tempted, which we shouldn't be and won't be, we really would affect the other side of the question, which is from the moment that you put your fingers into the conflict resolution, you're bound to irritate, you're bound to raise questions about your neutrality and your political positioning, and to be drawn into that makes our work for the future much more complicated in addressing the role that we're supposed to be about. But that doesn't come, without dilemma, sometimes at a personal level, in particular when we've been present for so long in armed conflicts. But it's very clear that is not our role, and we have to stick very clearly to what we are about.
Gentleman at the back here.
From the Asia Pacific Civil Military Centre of Excellence. We're very fortunate, Pierre, to have, of course, sitting in the front row there, Jeremy England, speak at most of our seminars, conferences, workshops, etc. And he's a very powerful advocate of neutrality. Nonetheless, we of course need to work on civil-military relations and how we can make them work in future. So you've already told us a little bit. Can we have some more of your thoughts on making civil-military relations work in future?
Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, for the positive comment. It will be then integrated into Jeremy's appraisal format. Of course, thank you also for the outstanding relations that we enjoy with your centre, because it's something that we've gained a lot from and appreciate very much and value deeply. The comment, I think, is very important. The one thing about the ICRC that is very clear is because we were born literally on the battlefield, we have for 150 years now engaged with armed forces in every form and shape, literally. And so there is no concern on the ICRC's part with sitting down with armed forces and engaging in dialogue. I mean, we've done that in almost every conflict that I can think of, whether it was in Bosnia during the end of the immediate post-war with I4 and S4, whether it's now with the ISAF and other deployments. And of course, there were discussions, for instance, around the whole PRT, Provincial Reconstruction teams in Afghanistan. But from our perspective, it was not about engaging in dialogue. We are prepared to have coordination take place and dialogue and exchange with armed forces in any sense, and to try and improve where we have potential impact on addressing issues in the civ-mil sense. We're prepared to do that. We just have to ensure that it is done based on an understanding that these are separate mandates and separate roles. And I don't think that we've often faced difficulties in addressing that, but I think Afghanistan is a context that has shown us that when you are in a direct hostile engagement as part of an international deployment, it is a different thing from a peacekeeping operation. And that brings different challenges, and it's very important that when we engage, for instance, with the provincial reconstruction teams or with the international forces on the ground, every single other actor in Afghanistan can understand what the rationale behind our engagement is in that sense. And again, that has to be clear in terms of the neutrality of the organization and the respect of the different roles. Within that framework, once that is established, there can be a lot of ground for discussions and dialogue, which we are very prepared to take. I can give an example of, frankly, I think a lot of credit goes to international forces and also US forces for how they have responded increasingly in transparent terms to our démarches and recommendations on the whole detention side of our operations, in the conduct of hostilities side of our operations. This has been of great importance, in fact, to the impact we have in the context. So again, I think we have no difficulty of engaging. It's just a matter of what are the foundations, and that everybody understands that we will not be part of a system where we are coordinated by others. If those elements are clear, all the rest can follow fairly easily.
Okay, for the next question.
G'day, Prashant, volunteer with the Red Cross. You joined the ICRC in 91, 20 years ago. In your opinion, what has been the biggest challenge to face the ICRC in the last 20 years, and how did it meet those challenges? And what will the next 20 years bring the ICRC and the evolution of warfare?
That should fill in the next 10 minutes, Pierre.
I'll show you, make an appointment for...
Hope you're not in a hurry to go back to wherever you came from.
Well, obviously, like most people in the ICRC, I would never have thought that I would spend 20 years necessarily, so that's an interesting reminder. But no, I think the big issue that all of us had to deal with was simply the ongoing transformation of armed conflict. And I think there was a sense when I started with many other colleagues around that time that we were just coming out of the phase of the Cold War, that we were entering a new era that seemed to be dominated by peacekeeping logics, although we then had, of course, the Caucasus and the Balkans and the Great Lakes region to remind us of how rapidly things can again become very dramatic in human terms in conflict-related dynamics. And it was also a big change in the humanitarian environment itself. Far more agencies operational than during the period of the Cold War, very clearly, where only a few were active. Today it's a very mixed and diverse environment. Some say competitive, but certainly very diverse. Many agencies, and increasingly also the involvement of, as we were saying, armed forces, governmental response directly and bilaterally in humanitarian terms. So a very different environment in that regard. Much more challenging in professional terms, because one moved from, I would say, a more intuitive humanitarian response to one more organized and more professional, with all the advantages but also the pressures around that. And certainly in ICRC term, one of the biggest changes probably around that period was an internal cultural change in terms of a decision by our board in 1996 to have the ICRC staff, in other words, in particular the expatriate staff, because of course the national staff was international by definition, but the expatriate base become internationalized, because for decades this organization was a predominantly Swiss organization. Predominantly is sort of the understatement in terms of its expatriate base, and that has changed significantly. If you take, for instance, our delegation today in Sudan, it's in terms of expatriates 43 different nationalities. So of course in internal terms that has meant a very big change, and it's an ongoing process because there's a lot of investment to go into that. And I think looking into the future, which is always a bit of a daring prospect, but 2-3 things come to mind. One is the element that I was referring to earlier, which I really believe that the humanitarian environment and the humanitarian sector, just to call it that, will change considerably over the next 10 to 15 years. And I frankly don't think we'll recognize it in 10 to 15 years because far more local and regional responses will dominate and challenge the more international actors, of which the ICRC is part. I think we've seen it during some of the responses in Asia. The sort of the Nargis cyclone comes to mind, where ASEAN states decided to lead coordination to that response. And I think we see that both in the Middle East, in Africa, Latin America, and much of Asia, as a sort of a challenge also to the notion that humanitarian action, which has sometimes been a bit of a one-way street response. I come to you and I define your needs, and this is increasingly challenged. People are a little bit fed up with that part of the humanitarian sector's culture. So that will change very strongly, and the question is, for organizations like the ICRC, are we able to adapt to that clearly enough and link up with those changes effectively enough to remain relevant over the next years? The other part is really, I think, the forms of armed conflict will continue to change very much, and the paradox is that we'll have a combination of new forms of attacks. People talk a lot about the drone warfare and the whole impact of potential future cyber forms of warfare, but that will coexist with increasingly fragmented and unregulated regions, both in rural and in urban settings, where entire parts of a city or a country will be beyond the reach of state institutions, with generating a lot of needs in terms of both humanitarian, social, and others, and where organizations, again, like the ICRC, will have to determine whether these are the potentially predominant forms of armed violence of the future, and how will we prepare for those.
We have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Hi, James Brown. I'm the military associate here at the Institute. Just wanted to press you on one of the really interesting points you made about the militarisation of aid. I wonder if you'd just be able to provide more detail on where you draw the line between what kind of humanitarian efforts you think are appropriate for militaries and what aren't, particularly with reference to, say, for example, the PRTs in Afghanistan. And secondly, maybe explain whether the ICRC is doing anything to press that point with the militaries themselves in any forum.
Okay, I think whether it's PRTs or any other form, let's just take the angle from the whole of government response, or what others call the comprehensive approaches and others. I think that, and this is, maybe I'll start from a personal view, I think it's legitimate from a governmental perspective when approaching a crisis to look at how best to combine the different types of assets and tools, as it were, that a government has available to it in addressing both the consequences and sometimes maybe the underlying causes of a conflict. And therefore, if you're in a state or in a government and you look at your diplomatic means, your political means, the whole military side of potentially deploying forces, but also the development, reconstruction, and humanitarian aspect, and that you look at that, I think it is understandable that that is all part of the equation and the strategy. But this is where my point is, where I see a very big difference, and I don't think that that was always acknowledged clearly enough, was that as we came out of the Cold War, that type of logic influenced very much thinking within the UN and within states that contributed to UN deployments as part of peacekeeping operations. It was really the idea that in a peacekeeping environment where all the parties somehow agree to the deployment, and you work on these different aspects, and you use these different tools in an environment that is receptive to it. When, however, you deploy into what I now just call, a hostile terrain with an active military engagement against an enemy, well, that of course has other implications for humanitarian agencies on the ground. And the point that we're making is not that military forces should abstain from responding in sort of reactive terms to needs that they find at the end of a confrontation, a clash, or where civilians are affected by a military operation. But clearly it becomes very problematic when, as we saw in an example that comes to mind from 2003 and 2004, where leaflets were dropped onto communities saying that in exchange for information about such and such a person from the opposition, well, the villages would receive humanitarian assistance. This is hugely problematic for us, because that then establishes a clear link between the counterinsurgency element and the humanitarian input. And it becomes very difficult on the ground for local actors to see the distinguishing lines between a vehicle from international forces that goes out on a civilian mission to assess needs in a region, and an ICRC vehicle or that of another organization 3 days later, followed by a military operation, and nobody is quite clear about where the intelligence gathering came from. And for the ICRC, it is crucial that we are understood as being separate from those logics. And it is that element that we find blurs, not only blurs, creates really disturbing and problematic lines for us. And we have to steer clear of that. And that's why our message is not against, it's just simply being very clear about what we stand for and how we approach it. And yes, to answer the other part of your question, we have raised issues around these questions at all levels within, whether it's at NATO, whether it's in the US, and here to just emphasize why we're talking about these points, because they are a very fundamental matter of how the ICRC is understood in the context. And I think it's also normal that we cross lines, as it were, in most of the armed conflicts. If any group or any armed forces develops the sense that the ICRC is actually there to collect information that may lead to something else, this becomes very problematic. We cannot be seen as such, and it's a huge effort to preserve those perceptions, to keep them intact and to keep them clear. So that's where we'd like to draw the line.
Well, thank you very much. I know they breed them tough in the ICRC, Pierre, but I must say, for somebody who's just gotten off a plane from Geneva, you've given us an incredibly lucid and interesting presentation. Can I ask everyone to join me in thanking Pierre Krähenbühl, the Director of Operations from the ICRC, for speaking to us today?